Logistics, seeing the supply chain. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all of our speakers so that they can just proceed one after the other. And we'll have a brief amount of time. You don't necessarily have to sit up there.
Okay.
You don't want to. We'll have a little bit of time afterwards for some Q&A, and we're going to have a brief reception to conclude the evening. So our first speaker is going to be Lian Young, who will be talking about SALT, media history. And then Dara Orenstein. I got it wrong already, right?
Okay.
Is it Steen or not?
Steen. Yeah.
Dara Orenstein, and I just asked and everything. Who will be presenting The Electric Eye Stands Guard, a history of the labors and logistics of surveillance at U.S. foreign trade zones. Our third speaker will be Ingrid Burrington, who will be presenting notes on a supply chain pedagogy. And our final speaker this evening will be Miriam, Posner, who will be presenting Seeing Like a Supply Chain, Understanding Data in Logistics. So, Liam, please.
Hello again. It's me. Sorry that there's a lot of Liam right at the start of this conference, but thanks to you all for being here. Thanks to the organizers, Matt, Nicole, Colette, and Tim. It's a real pleasure to be here. So this is a new project. It's really early days. Today is really just about kind of giving some preliminary shape to what have been to this point kind of fragments. So I'm in that exciting stage of research of just collecting and gleaning. So I'm really looking forward to your suggestions and impressions and corrections. So this morning I walked over to the corner of Spring and West Streets to see this controversial structure. It's the Manhattan District's 125 garage, and its architectural ambition seems all out of step with its humble purpose, which is to store salt. So there's a kind of an absurdity in the disjuncture between form and function of this building. And this disconnect, I think, mirrors, the disconnect of the container mirrors one at the heart of what it contains. While salt is banal and uninteresting, it is also one of 2 or 3 substances most central to the history of human culture and civilization. Salt has been a staple good of every settled community on record, and thousands more of which there are no material traces. There are a half dozen books that refer to salt as the 5th element alongside air, fire, water, and earth. Like these elements, salt is a bringer of life and a destroyer of worlds. The most effective and popular naturally occurring preservative, yet also an agent of decay, corrosion, and death. Our bodies require but do not produce salt, while our tongues privilege it to a degree few other tastes have achieved globally. The human appetite for salt, therefore, has been and continues to be voracious. We can read a really compelling history of commerce, trade, and empire through salt, and some people have. Here are just 3 examples. Salt is a parasite at the center of world historical change. From the emergence of proto-states of the Fertile Crescent, which taxed in grain and salt, to the Gabelle salt tax of pre-revolutionary France, to Mahatma Gandhi's salt march in the name of decolonization. And beyond biology and culture, salt has lessons to teach about language and imagination. I mean, I can't really think of another word that is so metaphorically overloaded. Salt of the earth, salt on the wound, to be worth one salt, taken with a grain of salt, on and on and on. Like language is salty even when we're not swearing. It's probably because salt is so central to everything that we do and are that relatively little has been written on it. We kind of take for granted what is always there. But given that it is as close to a universally valued substance as there is, I think, on the planet, a study of salt offers huge opportunities for comparative cultural and media studies. You might be surprised that I invoke the word media to describe salt, but if anything is what it does, then salt is a medium. It mediates not just social relations and historical forces I've been describing, but it also performs it performs functions that we normally associate with technical and signal-based media. In food preservation, for instance, salt chemically processes organic matter so that its nutrients can be stored over a longer time period and thus transported around the globe for exchange and ingestion by other bodies. Processing, storage, transmission, transportation. These were three key media functions analyzed by Friedrich Kittler in his influential studies of modernity's technical media. Gramophone, film, typewriter were the kind of paradigmatic examples. Salt reminds us that these functions are not only performed by media devices. So what I want to do is kind of cast these medial functions into the history of salt to see what we can learn about both logistical media on the one hand and the media of logistics on the other, which I kind of mentioned in the round table. I think these are two essential concepts for current debates about supply and command, and I'm interested in what that distinction is and if it matters. So first, thinking about logistical media through the lens of preservation. So logistical media is this concept we were talking about, John Peters developed, though lately it's kind of been overshadowed by his interest and emphasis on elemental media. But I think the two concepts are really closely linked, and it's my hunch that elemental media emerged from his thinking about logistics. So logistical media describes those media technologies that abstract, order, organize, and compute the basic coordinates of space and time. Logistical media are different from media that transmit and store messages and data, so broadcast and recording media, right? Logistical media are more about processing. Peter's three examples are calendar, clock, tower, which process space and time into standardized formats around which culture and society become organized. The rhythm of festivals and seasons, the minutes of the day to be counted and saved, views over territory from above. So logistical media are obviously sites of immense power and contestation. I think Peters uses the term logistical because it evokes space, time, and movement, the usually unnoticed basal techniques of measure, order, and mobilization, optimization as we talked about, upon which so much depends. It's through these devices and techniques that we come to sense, understand, model, and make the world. And logistical media offer us a particularly good view onto the way nonsense becomes processed into sense, which is the first step in establishing a system of knowledge or a structure of power. Salt is a logistical medium in that it reconfigures grids of temporal and spatial experience. That's part of the reason why I think it's been present in human societies for so long. It facilitates certain kinds of time axis manipulation, for instance, in expanding the time horizon of food, rendering new rhythms and habits of nourishment. It preserves by chemically processing organic material into a new state, so as to ward off spoilage and store nutritional value. And further, this new extended timescale affects spatial arrangements. Once food lasts longer, you can move it further, opening up new possibilities for trade, exchange, and gift economies. As a result, I think this processing function of salt has had huge consequences for the way humans, early and recent, organize themselves across time and space. Salt is logistical in a second sense. It is a basal medium for the storage of value. Not just the nutritional value of food, but because of its almost universal appeal, salt has also served for a long time as a money medium. Roman soldiers were famously paid in salt, hence our word salary. And as I mentioned, salt taxes have been some of the most reviled throughout history. When serving as currency, as in Rome, salt mediates the relation between state and citizen or employer and employee. Like other stores of value, it's a hidden third party in the transformation of labor power into something to be used or exchanged. Thus, access to salt, along with knowledge about how to harvest it, whether through mining or evaporation or other techniques, has been as tightly controlled throughout history as any other monopoly of knowledge. Because of these functions, salt has and continues to be precious cargo. And as cargo, I think it has lessons to teach us about the media of logistics, things like ships, containers, inventories, schedules, lists of provisions, techniques of record keeping, and all of the hidden operators that synchronize supply chains, past and present. So here I'm using logistics in a more kind of recognizable or conventional sense. It's related to Peter's logistical media, but it's less about mediation and it's more about circulation. Less, say, about processing and storage, more about transmission and transportation. Logistics, as all of you know, is primarily about movement, whether of things, data, or people. You know, a kind of hallmark of the logistical imaginary is its ability to render same. Everything just becomes cargo. Salt is something we've moved around a lot for like 10,000 years. Salt roads have been written onto the earth for at least that long, and early human settlement patterns become legible by triangulating extraction, distribution, consumption of salt. But if you'll allow it, I'm going to be a little more provincial than all of that. I'm from Canada. I work in a Canadian communication department, so you know, it might come as no surprise to you that my road into thinking about salt was shaped by that place, and specifically by Harold Innis's work on the economic history of Canada as a colonial state. Innis invented an influential stream of media theory at the University of Toronto in the 1930s, but almost nobody outside of Canada is familiar with his work. Most of you will know Marshall McLuhan, right, who did a lot to popularize Innis's late career work on ancient histories of writing and communication, but McLuhan himself always said his own work was but a footnote to his senior colleague. So they worked together for about 4 years at University of Toronto before Innis died in 1952, but they weren't particularly close, though that was much to McLuhan's chagrin. Before Innis ever thought about communication, he made his reputation as an economic historian. He rewrote the history of Canada, transforming it from outpost and outhouse of British Empire to a prime mover in the international economies of European exploration. He argued that the European pursuit of New World staples from the kind of late 15th century forward, staples such as fur, cod, lumber, and grain, structured both the social and economic dynamics of first contact between indigenous communities and European traders, and the technical and infrastructural development that would culminate in a permanent colonial state. Before there was a Canada with institutions, representational governments, or narratives about nationality and heritage, there were techniques of extraction, exchange, preservation, administration, and transportation. Together, these comprised, to borrow some of Peter's language, the infrastructural moorings of what would become the state of Canada once it was folded into the Westphalian state system. The proper picture of how all of this works, in his thought, only comes into view when you follow the staples themselves. And this is what he did. In preparation for his books on the fur trade and the cod fisheries, but also on placer gold mining in the BC interior and the Canadian Pacific Railway, he conducted extensive field work, which he called dirt research. I really love this term. I think it captures something about the granularity and the kind of grounded nature of the knowledge that he sought. He went out in the field, into canoes, and he gathered as much as he could. He observed, he listened, he sketched, he conversed, he listed. It was about sensory impressions. He canoed and portaged, he camped out at mining towns and trading outposts. This was the 1920s and 30s. There were still many human and material traces of these earlier staple economies. And he above all sought to glean from land, water, people, animals, and things, which is the way that Peter Van Wyck understands the field work. And when it came time to implot these rather infernal field notes, which are very difficult to read, when it came time to implot these into a narrative history, Innis drew as much from geology and biology as economics or political theory. So there's a kind of interdisciplinarity and synthesis, I think, are deep ethics that run through media theory right from the start. Hence, the Fur Trade in Canada book starts with 5 pages of ethology on the beaver. Innis said that knowledge of its physiology, habitat, the patterns of movement of the beaver were first required if one hoped to know anything about Canada. The cod fisheries book similarly begins with notes about water temperature and salinity off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland and on the specific gravity of cod's eggs. He never gave it a proper treatment, but salt was a hidden operator in each of these early studies, and it's particularly present in the cod fisheries. He acknowledges its importance, but only in passing. But I think when we shine light on these asides, kind of bring them into the center, we can see how salt supply was from the beginning a structuring agent in expeditions to the so-called New World. So, for instance, variations in supply determine the techniques of extraction and preservation employed by each of the imperial fisheries. Salt-rich France and Spain preferred to trawl for larger fish in the deep waters off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. Because they had salt on board, they could temporarily green cod on ship, so salt it temporarily on ship for transport back to Europe where longer-term salting could take place. But on the other hand, salt-poor Britain had to fish closer to the land in areas with more sunshine to facilitate a less salt-dependent technique of curing. So lacking ready access to salt, British vessels either needed to transport it from European markets or acquire it from competitors upon arriving in the New World. But in both cases, their salting of cod occurred on land, such as on Newfoundland's Avalon Peninsula, which is the kind of southeastern tip there. So salted on land for transport back to European markets. So this is not Newfoundland, it's Iceland in the 1920s, but I wanted to just give you a sense of what it looks like. With each passing season, British on-land salting sites became more permanent as sailing crews left equipment on land for future use. Eventually, sailors elected to stay behind so as to both protect this fixed capital and explore other possible bounties of the land. These shelters, camps, paths, and navigation equipment became the infrastructure upon which settlement and colonization would graft themselves. This kind of analysis, following the staples themselves, allowed Innes to deflate facile narratives that presumed the age of exploration as an expression of imperial grandeur, curiosity, or individual genius. Instead, these motivations and their effects are rooted in concrete economic and geographic considerations. The move is away from markets, prices, and military affairs and toward geography, oceanography, biology, navigation, food preservation, and logistics. So, of course, Innes's work is flawed and imperfect, right? It's, his white male optic was not immune to the pervasive racism of the time, particularly in his representation of indigenous communities. It's Eurocentric, right? It's all of these things. But I think that we can learn a lot from how it kind of telescopes between the absolute granularity of this paradigm of salt, cod, or beaver, whichever he's studying, kind of telescoping from that layer to these larger world historical vectors. And above all, I think we can learn from the way it crafts a theory of emergent historical change by rendering legible the supply chain of European conquest and colonization through the analysis of logistical media like salt and the media of logistics, containers, manifests, and inventories. So just to kind of wrap up, I mean, obviously this work is increasingly important today. We know now, thanks to so many of you here, that what demands our attention is not simply a global village of media users, devices, networks, and signals, but is a rather more complex planetary supply chain, an assemblage of bodies, devices, techniques, infrastructures, spaces, and times. The task before us is to properly render and model these extant forces so that they can maybe be redesigned, re-engineered. Much of this work is obviously well underway. I think Innes and the stream of media theory that he inspired has a lot to contribute to this project. Whatever we call them, staples, media, emblems, paradigms, units, these figures like salt help us to materialize the supply chain and its interconnections from the ground up and out, from the grain out, we might say. Such an approach opens vistas onto much longer histories of supply and command that I think, or I hope, can bring historical weight and build conceptual bridges to contemporary challenges. Thanks very much.
right, I just need to open my notes. Lots of logistics here. I had a major, I get to make the first logistics joke, although I guess maybe you did. I had a big logistical snafu getting here. I left my wallet at home. Yeah, so that's, yeah, okay. Well, exactly, we are train, but I didn't. I had to wait for the a later train, which is why I'm running behind in all kinds of ways here. So, and maybe someone would show me when it's sort of 10 minutes, or so if anyone want to volunteer? But I don't have my phone with me either. Okay, sorry. Okay, whew. All right. Okay, so hi. Very excited for this conference. It's already a great opening. I'm going to offer you a little more of a sort of just historical case study. And it's funny, I'm not sure how often, if at all, I've used the term logistics or logistical in this talk, such as it is, to the extent that it's even written down. Maybe I'll try to pepper it in. But this comes out of a book manuscript that I'm completing. It's a little piece of it that I would love to expand, think about more, but it has to do with the logistical unconscious, i.e. labor, and with the question of who polices the supply chain. So as the supply chain circles the world ever more, reformatting national borders, but not obliterating them, as Deb Cohen has showed us, what is the work of the national border in the age of the supply chain? How does that work, this extensive bordering, this seam, as Deb calls it? Literally, who's working the border is the way to think about what I'm showing you here. My research offers a window on this question because I study a spatial form that instantiates the border. In the US, it's called the foreign trade zone. And elsewhere in the world, it goes by the name of free zone, export processing zone, free trade zone, maquiladora, special economic zone. These are all iterations of a global form that in the US is authorized in 1934. I'm not going to maybe give you a satisfying explanation of what a zone is because that just would take more than 20 minutes, so we can chat later if you're curious for more explication. But basically, a zone is an enclave, a parcel of territory that is considered on U.S. soil but off U.S. customs territory. This is the basic definition. So commodities can enter the U.S. outside the tariff system into a zone and then leave as if they were never in the U.S. whatsoever. While in a zone, they can be manipulated, and that's why this word manipulation matters a lot in the zone context. I'll explain in a moment. Versus manufactured in various ways, all with American labor. Supposedly is the reason people want to open these. So it's basically an export processing zone. That's especially what it becomes in the U.S. So federal officials celebrated the zone concept because they believed that it offered a means of spurring foreign commerce without threatening domestic industry. So it was very much premised on a really artificial distinction between industry and commerce. So as if the two spheres could be separated, production and distribution or circulation. So indeed, manufacturing was outright prohibited in the Foreign Trade Zones Act of 1934. When merchants in New York City first proposed zone legislation in the mid-1890s, they hoped to deploy pockets of deregulation to boost receipts at seaports. So this was about a vision of, a merchant marine. And we tend not to think of the U.S. as a seafaring nation. So this comes out of a long 19th century, playground spat between, New York City and London, or, it's about an ambition to become the warehouse of the world. That's literally a phrase from the 19th century. And the hope was that this could be balanced, this ambition, with, protection for the protectionists of the heartland of, all the agricultural and industrial production in the interior, right? So the merchants, it was mainly merchants who wanted zones. They wanted to lure international traffic to what they called vestibules, right outside the tariff wall. Foreign trade zones would redirect the shipping and re-export trade in Mexican garbanzo beans and Argentine beef from Liverpool to New York City, and thereby elevate the U.S. to supremacy in the Western Hemisphere. So this was especially a big plug during the era of the good neighbor policy, right? Moving the goods was the point, not making them. So it's about this an effort at that kind of distinction between moving and making. The national market would remain intact because the zone concept isolated commerce from industry. As a port commissioner from San Francisco reassured congressmen in 1919 in one of many hearings on this concept, take the Ford assembly plant for automobiles, he said. Do you expect to see that in the free zones? Not at all, never. Of course, you know where I'm going. Trying to operate two screens at once. So this, as I hope you can appreciate, this legal fiction is quite fantastical, really. I mean, what does extraterritoriality look like, right? And so I love that this archive is really trippy a lot of the time, as in this aesthetic of this kind of montage style. These are just, pamphlets distributed to, regular importer-exporters. Shout out to that band, Shannon. Just these were just mailers, advertising the zone. Use us rather than Bush Terminal. These are just warehousing businesses basically. But Bush Terminal wasn't producing this kind of pamphlet, right? And that surrealism was evident in the rhetoric around the zone too. So I have all kinds of wonderful phrases people use to try to convey what this was. A tiny free city, a halfway house of trade, a commercial waiting room, and my favorite, an Ellis Island for merchandise. So you can understand then that that this enclave needed to be scrupulously bounded and delineated because of what it threatened or promised. Here's an aerial view that ran in the New York Times. Notice the line drawn around the zone in this circular photo in the bottom. Not exactly up to GIS standards, right? But this is, and you see this again, on any aerial photograph on the print, a white line would be drawn in to demarcate the existence of the zone. By law, the zone was, quote, an isolated, enclosed, and policed area, and its boundary was to conform to precise measurements. FTZ regulations, I'll refer to it as an FTZ, required a fence of, quote, not less than number 6 gauge with a mesh not exceeding 2 inches and an overall height of at least 10 feet above the concrete base in which the posts are set, etc. Quote, topped by at least 3 strands of galvanized barbed wire, 4-point type, each strand consisting of 2 strands of numbered 12.5 gauge wire, and on and on and on. So there's a sort of an earnestness about the kind of conspicuous security that the zone would present to the world, to the public. No stone was to be left unturned for the, quote, proper protection of the revenue, because that was nominally the worry that smugglers would remove dutiable goods from the zone and that the government would lose money. As the New York Times put it, quote, the enclosed area will be about as closely regulated and guarded as though it were a prison. This photograph was reprinted in a number of newspapers, and the Washington Post captioned it something about, the, quote, frontier at the, foreign trade zone at Staten Island. And so you can see how something that has struck me as I gather as much photographic material as possible, because I see this history visually, and it's a way that that's another kind of conversation about logistics as a method. It's that I've been able to make a lot of conceptual connections by looking at visual evidence, as seriously as, the memoranda and so on. And so what I've noticed is, for example, the ubiquity of the fence in any depiction of the zone. You always have the fence and even usually the sign too, as a way to mark this space as outside, as kind of a fortress, right? And you see that too, even in the seals, the different seals that were proposed by the Federal Foreign Trade Zones Board. A number of them include barbed wire fencing. That none of those were chosen, but because, yeah. About that fence. The problem is the regulations did not specify how to fence a water boundary. And so the designers of Zone 1, if I didn't clarify exactly, the first zone in the nation's first, foreign trade zone opened on Staten Island in Stapleton, if you know Staten Island at all, 92 acres of Stapleton on the New York, facing Wall Street. These were white elephant docks. They'd gone unused since World War I, and so everyone was behind siting a zone there and really felt that New York should be the first city for a zone. President Roosevelt was on board. It was kind of a fait accompli, and so, indeed, Staten Island hosted the first zone, and so, and that's where it is. But right, what to do about the water border? The national border along the water. So the designers of Zone 1 had to come up with a solution in order to apply to the FTZ board for permission to open a zone. After much research, they settled on, quote, a new kind of fence, as it was touted in Science newsletter, quote, which no one yet has been able to climb or evade. The, quote, electric eye was the latest trend in laser equipment, and it was the reason why doors swung open at Pennsylvania Station automatically. In fact, it was modeled on those doors at Penn Station. Whenever it sensed a disturbance of a laser beam, it triggered an electrical current, activating a door, a bell, or an alarm. Deployed at the zone at the outer edges of the piers, it would project an infrared light across the water. So if a swimmer or a boat were to interrupt this laser beam, a siren would sound. An ADT transmitter article, Electric Eye Stand Guard, promised that the device would thwart smugglers, quote, marking the customs boundary as definitely as though built of steel and concrete. Zone 1's engineers had a little help with this venture, and those engineers, by the way, like all of the men involved in constructing the zone, were employees of the WPA, the Work Projects Administration, on loan from Mayor LaGuardia. I just find this picture pretty funny somehow. At first, they conferred with General Electric, Westinghouse, and the Signaphone Corporation, but talks eventually stalled because of the WPA's refusal to commit sufficient resources. Then the lead engineer found his way to American District Telegraph, ADT, via a colleague on the FTZ survey, an ex-Army major with friends on ADT's directorate. ADT was investigating similar alarm mechanisms and quickly made its staff and equipment available to the WPA FTZ survey. Together, they adapted the electric eye to Zone 1's unique conditions, testing it at dawn in the morning mist of the New Jersey wetlands and across the roofs of skyscrapers in Midtown Manhattan. This work involved some stiff climbing, the lead engineer noted in his report. They built a contraption that housed the electric eye and that moved it up and down with the tides. The lead engineer later concluded that the project had hinged on ADT's assistance. Quote, they granted me every facility of the research laboratory and allocated funds necessary to carry on the work. Any success is in large part attributable to the active support I have received from ADT. I just think that that's noteworthy, that this sort of, private public partnership that is so typical of contemporary logistics was present even in this situation. This lead engineer was especially proud of how the electric eye improved upon the standard practice at the Free Zone, which is Hamburg's Freihafen, I don't speak German, which opened in 1882, where guards had to patrol the harbor and reposition a floating barrier pictured at the top in order to admit each vessel. So no laser beams in Hamburg. So this was a first, the U.S. solution. Whether the electric eye could be deemed a success was doubtful. If nothing else, the gizmo gave fodder to journalists. On loan from GE for $16 a day, no small sum, it often malfunctioned, twice slipping off its elevator and plunging into the water. Quote, "It sounds off a deafening siren at intervals," the Staten Island Advance reported, quoting officials from the nearby Marine Hospital, basically sort of right next door, who disliked that the zone disturbs patients. Clearly, this snafu merited recognition from the New Yorker and the talk of the town. In 1939, the magazine wrote about the new technology at Zone 1, quote, "The idea was that if pirates attempted to creep up to the piers and steal freight, their boat would break the beam and sound an alarm. Well, the alarm sounds day and night, keeping the special guards on the run, but it's never pirates." And then here's the punchline. You could probably guess what it is, easy enough. Seagulls, you know. A bit on ADT, which Matt can tell us, is created in 1873 as a telegraph company, centering on the cheap labor of young boys, basically. Here's an old board game on how to optimize the self as a messenger boy for a company like ADT. Here, a photograph by Lewis Hine around 1910 or so of a messenger boy, or here another by Hine. But as the telephone replaced the messenger boys, the telegraph companies realized that, as the Saturday Evening Post put it, they were plugged into the wrong number and began to look for new sources of revenue. So they started marketing alarms. And here's what I'm interested in. Call boxes were designed to monitor lazy watchmen. That's really the whole origin of the alarm, is a kind of labor history of the watchman. The watchman had to call in at specific intervals on his route, right? And legend has it that the first alarm was modeled on a soldering device that was fabricated by night watchmen who wanted to be able to sleep on the job. Who will watch the watchman is the big question for ADT. Starting with the West India docks, in fact, in London, as we know from Peter Linebaugh, this is the question of circulation period of its history, right? That surveillance has always entailed, first and foremost, the surveillance of labor. I'd also draw your attention to the age of this watchman versus the youth of the messenger boys. So there's a kind of limit on how exploitable he is versus these teams of gangs of boys, right? So this is you wouldn't believe the ubiquity of this language and just how often I come across it in kind of quotidian advertising in management magazines of the early 20th century. This is an ad for a fence company, It's the fence is a watchman that never sleeps, right? And my 10-year-old son, when I was telling him about this paper, said, "Oh yeah, right. It's like the Hardy Boys. Usually they're able to sneak around at night because the watchman has fallen asleep, right?" And that's he's my son, so he's brilliant, right? But it just struck me as actually so great that he immediately understood this kind of trope, recognized it as such, the sleeping of the watchman, meaning like the non-productivity of this labor. It's again and again and again, the watchman dozes, the watchman asleep at at work. Keep that in mind. I think of it is super important to this entire history. And then I love this second riff on that cover, right? This is from the FSA archive, 1943, Baltimore, and the caption is "Watchman working on an ingrown toenail." And I offer this as also just a reminder of the camera as surveillance itself, right? That it feels like a kind of judgmental image, catching him not snoozing but primping, right? The technology behind the electric eye found all sorts of uses during the post-war era, and all sorts of critics. In 1950, it almost replaced baseball umpires, and they were not happy about that. Some of you may know how it was taken up on the battlefront. I actually learned of this only recently, hearing an interview with Yasha Levine about his new book, Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet, that in Vietnam, starting in 1968, planes dropped sensors throughout the battlefield as a way to kind of erect an electric barrier. This ended in 1973, and then at that point the U.S. Border Patrol instituted the same practice at the U.S.-Mexico border. But also in 1973, the technology was taken up on the home front in the sense of figuring out a way to keep Spot in the backyard through the invisible fence for dogs. And so I want to stay with this canine case study for a moment, just to kind of make a point about what's at stake for me in histories of surveillance, not to diminish this other work coming out of, say, the Yasha Levine trajectory. But so this is the ADT logo by the 1970s, and I'm just, if this comparison works, I don't know, but I would say there's something about two ways to think about surveillance, what's happening. One, the surveilled, and I think that's the way we tend to deal with surveillance. I mean, all of the people crossing the border, or and so on. This is and civil liberties concerns and so on. Oh darn. But the other would be my interest in the surveillant, the person performing this labor. So back to the zone system. Meanwhile, all was not quiet on the zone front, so I'm going to have to just kind of skip over things out of concern for time. Basically, in the 1950s and 1960s, zones were losing money in a big way, and in the red, and even a few of them closing. These are cities, municipal governments that run the zones, and maybe private operators that sort of contract the right to operate them. So both parties are feeling the hurt, and it's because of the security guard salaries. So the federal government, the Treasury Department, which partly oversees the zone system, but gives it no money. So this is a purely sort of permissive system. It's kind of cooperative federalism, we call it, where it's only the localities that fund it, but they need permission from the federal government in order to operate the zone, open them. The Treasury Department said, you need X number of customs guards at any zone, and this is what they must do, and no discussion about it. And no, we're not going to pay for them either. So, you have to pay for them. But these are the people who sleep, right? This is like the completely non-productive labor. So it was a huge problem. And in fact, actually, the number of guards required at a given zone would even increase during this period from, like at Zone 1, 9 guards in 1940, up to 129 part-time guards by 1949. So that's a major expense. So that in 1962, the zone system was quite small. As I said, a few zones had closed, and an economic geographer who wrote a book about the zone system in 1956, basically declared it dead, right? But then it came back to life, and between 1970 and 1984, the FTZ board approved 113 general purpose zones. So what happened? The invention of the subzone. The subzone is basically a zone designation for any existing facility or one that's created. It's a way to, declare this room off U.S. Customs territory. This building could be a subzone. Part of the Manhattan Diamond District, subzones open there, for example. So no longer did you need all of the kind of fixed capital costs of a whole port, kind of apparatus, and you didn't have to worry anymore about the costly real estate at the port. You could take the zone to Ford, and that's indeed what happened. So that by the 1980s, every single auto assembly plant in Detroit was a subzone. So all of these cars are rolling off of foreign territory in a sense, imported from Detroit. That Chrysler slogan, it's true, right? And this happened because of a change in the regulations. None of this is happening, in any kind of public sphere. So the subzone was emblematic of the global assembly line, of the fragmentation of production, and in ways I have no time to detail. But what I want to underline briefly in closing is that this reconfiguration of space triggered a corresponding recalibration of the labors and logistics of surveillance at the zones. At both the old-style general-purpose zones and the new subzones, such as at Nissan's assembly plant in Smyrna, Tennessee, this was true. And to summarize the shift, essentially, we convoked the paradigm that Deleuze would propose 10 years later. It was a shift from discipline to control, as I see it. The fence remained an element of the panopticon-like discipline of the surveillance of the zone, but less conspicuously so. When I tried to, kind of just cruise around this subzone in Tennessee, I had to drive for a while even to kind of find this sign. No longer is it clear if you're passing subzones on the interstate that they exist as such. And I think I have not tried to conduct a study, but I'm assuming that most people working in these sites have really no idea that these are considered extraterritorial, right? And in place of a discrete task-specific, site-specific monitoring with one guard responsible for one beat, et cetera, the Nissan operation was a study in what we call Toyotaism, an effort at total oversight of each widget, each worker, each minute, right? In 1986, this shift was turbocharged by a pivotal revision in the FTZ regulations. The FTZ board stopped forcing zone operators to reimburse the Treasury Department for in-residence customs guards and instead instituted a regimen of periodic audits, facilitated, of course, by cutting-edge computer software. So computers substituted for customs guards, and security was enacted through electric eyes that tracked workers' movements through cameras and so on, but it was really more the computer control room that became the kind of nucleus of the zone and its integrity as a border. It's like being inside a customs area in any international airport, Nissan's security czar explained to a magazine. He also commended the, quote, added benefits of compliance with the FTZ board's regulations. The strictures of the zone concept lent the assembly plant, quote, an atmosphere of federal law enforcement, to which he attributed the, quote, low percentage of employee theft at Nissan and, quote, little trouble with drugs in the workplace. So I've yet to get my hands on a photograph of a control room of a foreign train zone, and no coincidence. So instead I offer you this image, which I discovered via the LinkedIn account of a zone administrator. This apparatus looks like the electric eye, and to be sure, it developed out of the desire for automation, first displayed at Zone 1 in 1937. But what strikes me as significant about it is that it represents a recoding of the labor of surveillance and of the encounter between surveillant and surveilled. The electric eye, after all, was sort of an even swap, an eye for an eye, a robot for a worker. I mean, in a way, that's how I read, the kind of that early experimentation with automation at the zone. This way of seeing, in contrast, is networked and distributed, much different. And needless to say, it does not eliminate labor. So to cite my 10-year-old again, when I was, explaining this aspect of it to him, he pointed this out to me, saying, yeah, right, the only way you can replace a guard is with a robot, but then someone still has to watch the robot, right? So either he's highly sophisticated, or more likely, this is a sort of basic point about automation and even about the labor of surveillance that we forget the more we learn, right? And a quick coda about ADT and the social history of the supply chain. By the late 1970s, ADT was struggling in the commercial sector where business was stagnating. So burglar alarms and crime, noted Forbes in 1977, paid dividends. Crime paid, especially as the national border was under siege by extraterrestrials and by close encounters of the third kind, thanks to the upheavals of America's long wars in the global south. So I'm referring to the uptick in migration after 1965. And as Steven Spielberg demonstrated, that vulnerability was felt even in the suburbs and other bedroom communities. In this atmosphere, ADT cultivated a strong market in homeland security. So I leave you with this amazing ad, which ran in major newspapers from late 1983 into the spring of 1984, when Donna Haraway published her seminal take on the integrated circuit of the global assembly line, the Cyborg Manifesto. So now ADT watches not only the watchmen, but all of us too.
Fantastic slideshow. Do I do presenter view? Does it matter? Okay. Cool. Because everything is tight for time, I'm going to try to go fast. Thank you so much for having me. It's always really humbling to be in events like this. So I don't know if it's super important to explain how I briefly sort of was cosplaying as a graduate student and ended up enrolled in a course on supply chain management at a unnamed engineering school in New York City last year. In an audience like this, I imagine sort of why I thought that was a good idea might be sort of self-evident. But maybe by way of introduction, I should just sort of contextualize. I've been sort of academia adjacent for the last 5 years, but I'm sort of a feral animal in a confused cage most of the time in these environments. And one of the things I've never totally understood about sort of the study and media around logistics and supply chains is how this stuff kind of keeps happening, how people who work in supply chains kind of keep recreating these regimes that can perpetuate many, many harms in spite of sort of a voluminous, literature about their fraught nature written by, many people in this room. And so I was sort of curious where this sort of the pedagogy of supply chains fits into this larger discussion of where business and engineering education currently are at, and sort of the paucity of ethics in both, like what kind of questions could be brought to supply chain material. And my kind of anecdotal knowledge of supply chain practitioners and experience interacting with them had mostly been people who had sort of fallen into it. But, there are certificates and master's programs, right? And so assuming people go to school to learn how to do a supply chain, I didn't really know what they actually learned. So, the particulars of this class that I happened to be enrolled in were, pretty straightforward, right? Like lecture format, some quizzes, a midterm. We had one semester-long project in which we were put into groups which were all assigned an object that could be purchased at Dollar Tree and asked to construct a hypothetical supply chain map where we could construct that item at 67 cents on the dollar. Which I think that's literally the setup for a Natalie Jeremenjenko project. And I feel like that's the sort of class that I would expect would get taught in this department. We had a hex wrench. My colleague, I did not make these slides, but my colleague was really into using impact. I was like, go with it, it's fine. The centerpiece of this class, which I'm going to focus most of this talk on because I don't have a ton of time, that I wanted to kind of think might be of most interest here was our textbook, which was written by the instructor, and I'm guessing has only ever been taught by the instructor. This is, again, so supply chain textbooks also, all textbooks are a racket. So I did a very non-scientific study because I couldn't buy as many supply chain textbooks as I would have liked to have surveyed. But I also went and kind of just looked at, what are some of the top programs? What are their syllabi like? And based on that, it seemed like I got a textbook that, more or less kind of had a similar quality across them. There's a few kind of recurring tropes. A lot of diagrams like this, a lot of flow charts. This concept of sort of the source, make, deliver, that's literally the chapter sections of the textbook that I had. And I'm just going to jump through these really fast because they're kind of entertaining in a certain way. Sure, east source, I love those sorts of the burst things. This means something, but I think it mostly just means I know what I'm talking about because I made a diagram, KPIs, yeah, great, okay. I actually do really like the distribution center footprint diagram, but back to this textbook. Oh, and sorry, one other quick thing. I would say across the board, these textbooks don't really get into actual software and tools all that much, probably because that stuff's really proprietary, and also they would become dated quite quick. They kind of acknowledge that enterprise software stuff exists, but it's in ways actually much more about kind of the human experience. And supply chain construction as a textbook has a really interesting, unique thing compared to a lot of the other stuff I was looking at, which is, it has no real world case studies. Most of these other books, they'll be Apple, this is how they do it, or CSX, what we can learn from the experts in the field. Everything in here is a hypothetical. And it ranges from things you run a flower shop, to what is kind of a recurring trope of the text. So every chapter of the book opens with an interlude from a fictionalized account of a subsidiary of a large electronics company working to develop a supply chain for a new line of uninterruptible power supply banks, batteries for a separate division of the company's new line of mid-market servers. So thrilling literary intrigue it maybe is not, but the purpose of these interludes is kind of to portray the work of the supply chain practitioner like in situ, like, right, like this is what you'll really have to do, because presumably we're training you to go get a job at HP or something. It's also like a pretty blatantly like light fictionalization of the author's experiences. You know, there's this moment of like, who is this supply chain expert to whom you have been alluding? It is Bill, our director of supply chain. He knows all about supply chains. He is respected among his peers. May I remind you, the author of this textbook is named William. And also, he, you know, Bill goes on throughout the text to be sort of the anchor holding this entire supply chain project and his colleagues together. So, you know, if a lot of the work that people in this, you know, attending this event kind of look at as kind of trying to constitute a sort of a view from below from supply chains, and if like corporate social responsibility documents sort of aspire towards a view from nowhere, we are like kind of directly at the view from the middle, right? This is not really a journey into the heart of darkness and maybe more the heart of like a certain kind of fragile corporate masculine mediocrity, which can be a pretty scary place. And in particular, can be like a pretty scared place. Because like our opening chapter of this story that takes us on the supply chain journey is full of desperation. Like basically the decision to enter this new product line is driven by like declining sales and missed profit targets. Finance can't fix this problem. Alice, engineering and marketing have to solve it. And marketing, in fact, is the one who solves it, because the decision to even enter into the UPS market comes from Jerry, a marketing VP who is described as new to the division and destined to move onward and upward. He viewed the position as a stepping stone to greater achievements. There's like a little bit of resentment of Jerry going on in this whole thing, which is like kind of a setup for a later reveal in the narrative. So this combination of like economic anxiety and sort of the charisma of a hotshot marketing guy pushes the power products division into this project despite not really knowing whether or not like it's a good idea. So chapters 4 and 5 introduce sort of our central latent conflicts of the text, which are kind of emblematic of problems that large corporations kind of working on supply chain projects might run into. The first one is corporate information silos, right? So the team kind of agrees to use these like placeholder numbers for like determining their sales and production goals for like how many of these UPSs they need to make, because they're unable to receive more accurate numbers from marketing, presumably because maybe like Jerry wants everyone to forget that this was like his fucking idea. The other latent conflict, very familiar kind of, but also maybe speaks to the time period at which our author was maybe like doing a lot of this work, is the challenge of domestic versus offshore manufacturing, right? While the idea of having fewer domestic manufacturing jobs worries some on the team, particularly Donna, you know, they're kind of under pressure, right? They have to deliver a competitively priced product. They have to get within this $500 price point. And so, you know, following a visit to like what's frequently, like they use the phrase exotic a lot in the chapter where they go to Malaysia to visit the supplier. It's like kind of awkward and uncomfortable. But the team seems confident after this experience that things will go like well and within budget. I don't know if we have time to talk about the pro tips for learning about other cultures section of the book, but needless to say, challenges arise, right? The first shipment, there's some logistical confusion between the difference between Kennedy and Newark. The pallets come in disarray and the products are damaged. There's a moment where nobody bothered to notice that having an Israeli component in their product was going to cause challenges with their Malaysian manufacturer. Like, what she's like, makes you say, like, you know, don't you know that Malaysia has a trade embargo with Israel? Like, this was not, I guess, part of their like learning about other cultures research. And of course, you know, we come to the highly telegraphed moment where, you know, the marketing sales forecasts are far lower than the inflated expectations that the team had used as a baseline. Then, of course, you know, to make matters worse, it turns out that a chief rival on the market has introduced like a competitive product that's like $100 cheaper than our heroes. So we're given this kind of like really dramatic, I'm making, it's maybe I'm having more fun with it than you are, but, you know, this is stuff that doesn't really appear in the kind of rhetoric of like what it is to do a logistics and a supply chain, right? Like the view from nowhere sort of seeks to smooth out these sort of persnickety human problems and misunderstandings, and sort of the view from the middle, the, you know, perspective of our, like, you know, heroes of the Power Products division, kind of aspires to that view. You know, like it would be nice to abstract all of the kind of like labor and material and just sort of nodes and edges and standardized workflows, but like mostly like diagrams like this and this sort of assumption that there's like a way to do it right that isn't going to come up with all these weird snags, it mostly serves kind of a much higher, more abstract force that kind of hovers over the entire text, which is, you know, C-suite executives who's going to decide if, you know, this project was a good idea or not, and like they're the ones with whom our heroes' fates lie in the balance. Which the book ends on like a surprisingly grim note. So I'm just going to read some of it. So, like, basically they've like finished the thing, the product's out, and they're having a little like postmortem, and one character goes like, I've heard some rumblings in the past couple of weeks. Some people are really disappointed that we cannot manufacture the new products here. They are afraid their jobs are no longer secure. They may be right, said Steve, the chief executive officer. And he goes up, we have 1 year to achieve 16 million to 18 million in sales, or the conversation will be about exiting this business. The next page is a bibliography. Like, this is the textbook. And like, you know, I kind of naively didn't have very high expectations for the literary value of a supply chain textbook. And I didn't expect such sort of a stark acknowledgement of like the futility and uncertainty of corporate existence, like directly in the text. I may have like accidentally stumbled upon like the most subversive supply chain textbook ever. But I think, you know, the broader kind of blind spots of supply chain pedagogy, the fact that these textbooks don't bring up the kind of stuff that comes up at conferences like these, questions about like, you know, no one in this book ever asked like, why are labor costs so much cheaper in this place? And what, you know, what are labor conditions like on a day-to-day basis with our outsourced, you know, work? And, you know, whether, is this product a good idea or not? Like, these kind of become blind spots and are obscured because of all of these sort of immediate and quotidian challenges of like legit, like where Newark versus Kennedy and the pallets and fucking Jerry, right? Like, at no point in a supply chain textbook is like a student ever encouraged to kind of look the other way or engaged on ethical behavior, but like ultimately the view from middle management, if we can say there is like a singular view, is that of an individual who is sort of equally kind of victimized by the vicissitudes of like high-level corporate power as the like lower in the supply chain laborers that they themselves are exploiting. And, you know, frankly, they're kind of only motivated to achieve a certain degree of like compliance within this system, not necessarily thinking about what the so-called right thing to do is or whether this is a good idea at all. So maybe like to kind of bring this back, because I just, you know, want to be quick, is into this question about sort of like where ethics fit into the education around, you know, business practices, engineering. I feel like by the time you've gotten to like the class where you're reading this textbook, it may like be too late. Or it might not be productive to sort of try and insert those harder problems. Like, you know, MCC students are like, I highly encourage you to go take this class. It's over at Tandon. But whether or not you're going to be able to radicalize anyone into having like critical interrogations of the supply chain, I think most likely, you know, you might cultivate, like it might just further cultivate a sort of defensiveness of the student. Like, I'm just trying to find a place in this, you know, fucked up world and get a job, right? There might be an opportunity to like cultivate solidarity like across the supply chain by showing the ways in which, you know, these oppressions are intertwined with one another, that maybe we could turn everyone against corporate. There's a moment I keep thinking about on page 82 of this book where like it's mostly a section where they're talking about how like you need to learn how to work with people, but there's a sentence where it just goes like, politics is about the separation of what someone controls, what someone does not control but can influence, and what is totally out of someone's influence. I'm very intrigued by kind of like, what happens if you kind of like try to like unpack the textbook at like a deeper level, or like how could you think about like where you could reframe and rethink how students learn and where students learn about how these systems work? Like maybe you don't learn it in the professional development environment. Where is the other place this pedagogy should exist? And maybe that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much.
Well, that was awesome and hard to follow. 3 awesome, hard to follow presentations, actually. So I'll do my best. try to time this. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. As Dara was speaking, I was remembering drafting our dissertation prospectuses together back in grad school, and I think some of her preoccupations have infected me over the years, so it's a special pleasure to be on a panel with her. In 2011, when Steve Jobs handed over Apple's reins to Tim Cook, the reception was a bit lukewarm. Cook boasts none of Jobs' glamour or panache, but savvy industry observers knew what the anointing was about: Apple's supply chain. Cook came from operations, the arm of Apple that deals with procurement and distribution, and it may lack the sheen of marketing or design, but increasingly, as many of you probably know, a company's supply chain is what counts. In fact, though, the term chain is misleading. Many supply networks more closely resemble rivers or neural pathways. We hear a lot about Apple's Foxconn assembly plants in China, but that's only part of the story. The components come from all over the world. And these pathways are never static. As we'll see, they change rapidly, triggered by global economic conditions or events on the ground. It's hard to take a snapshot of a supply chain because it moves too fast. Since the 1980s, supply chain management has boomed as a field of study within business schools, as we learned from Ingrid, and as an area of professional practice within corporations themselves. And yet, for all the volumes dedicated to it within the literature, some significant aspects of SCM remain mysterious to the outside observer. For example, if Apple's supply chain expertise is so good, why can it not get a handle on labor conditions at its Chinese suppliers? Now, those inclined to cynicism might doubt the strength of Apple's commitment to ferreting out conditions in its factories. But then what do we make of Fairphone, the smartphone whose selling point is a transparent supply chain, but which quickly conceded that it could not ethically source all of its components? That would be nearly impossible, the founder said. So how did we get to this point where companies can choreograph their supply chains with exquisite timing and precision, but still, and I think accurately, claim ignorance about the conditions of their product's assembly? Well, the more time I've spent with supply chains, the more I've realized that these massive tentacular structures are built as much on data and software as they are on container ships and cranes. So my presentation takes on this question of how supply chains can be so dependable in the sense that we know exactly when our Amazon package is going to arrive, and yet so unknowable in the sense that we have only the vaguest idea of where the package came from. And I find evidence of this particular epistemological zone, this dance between omniscience and ignorance, down in supply chain software itself, and to the forms of data that the software transmits. So this close reading of supply chain software is part of what I want to accomplish today. But in addition, I want to spend some time excavating the epistemological regime within which this particular conception of data has flourished. So I'll argue that we get to the contemporary supply chain via a very specific shift in the way we understand and communicate information over the long 20th century. Seeing like a supply chain, I'll suggest, both depends on and reinscribes some of the key assumptions about colonialism, both about human difference and about the way value can be captured and transmitted. So supply chain management in its modern incarnation emerged in the context of increasing competition from Japanese manufacturers, and particularly Japanese innovations in just-in-time or lean manufacturing, in which a supplier tries to keep the absolute minimum inventory on hand to fulfill demand. With just-in-time, the supplier can avoid tying up capital in unsold inventory. But it also means that information about demand needs to be near perfect and near instantaneous in order to avoid product shortages. And it was in this context that Peter Drucker, the management expert, wrote what is widely considered one of the founding documents of modern supply chain management. Distribution, Drucker claimed in 1962, constitutes, quote, the economy's dark continent. We know little more about distribution today than Napoleon's contemporaries knew about the interior of Africa. And I'll return to this rather startling remark shortly. But in order to accomplish the perfect knowledge that Drucker dreamed of, companies need to have huge amounts of interoperable data, and they also need to have both a detailed and a bird's eye view of all their operations. And they do this, of course, by using software. The industry standard for monitoring business operations, everything from sales projections to transportation to HR, is SAP. Let's see if this works.
SAP, the world leader in business software. SAP is a part of almost everything you do, from your alarm clock to your breakfast cereal, your computer, even your car was most likely produced by organizations with SAP at the heart of their processes.
My name is Burrington. I'm the Vice President of Enterprise Solutions for PepsiCo.
Jennifer Saran, and I am the Corporate Treasurer of eBay.
Ryan Hemwell. I'm the Manager of Finance for CKE Restaurant.
Bobby Joseph. I'm Senior Manager of Baker Hughes.
Head of Information and Integration Architecture at Central.
I'm a Global Supply Chain Manager at Snowflake.
And I run SAP.
I run SAP.
SAP.
And PepsiCo runs SAP.
They do. So SAP was founded in 1972 by 5 German ex-employees of IBM. And I know Matt knows a ton more about this than I do. But I can tell you that it was part of the push towards systems integration that characterized management thinking of the period, as Deborah Cohen has discussed. Now, SAP is not the only software for business operations, but as the video suggests, it's the system with the most market share. Walmart runs SAP, for example. And although you may not have dealt directly with SAP, it's ubiquitous in large organizations. I like to do like selfies with the billboards at airports and stuff. That seems to be where you see it. Now, as one might imagine for a business system designed to handle a product's journey from idea to raw material to customer, SAP software is astoundingly complex. In fact, I say SAP software, but it's not really one thing. It's a suite of tools joined together through a shared database. And here I want to focus on the set of SAP tools designed to handle a company's supply chain. Most of these are subsumed under what's called the Advanced Planning and Optimization, or APO module. This is the supply chain cockpit, which is the supply chain manager's highest level view of a company's operations within SAP. With the cockpit, the manager can access a graphical representation of a company's supply chain as a map, and in separate panes pull up information on locations, products, and resources. As in the image here, the supply chain cockpit includes an alert manager, where the manager can be notified of alerts, a term that encompasses things like production slowdowns, transportation delays, or plant closures. With SAP SCM software, an engineer can also take advantage of advanced planning capability, at least in theory, assembling a model of production and distribution locations, resources, and sales forecasts, and, again, theoretically, employing built-in mathematical modeling techniques to optimize the routes goods should travel. So using neural networking and other machine learning techniques, according to this idea, SAP's software can actually help a company's supply chain self-heal, given the proper data. SAP's SCM software can incorporate a number of machine learning strategies, meaning that rather than centralizing planning in one place, the system continually gathers all available historical and current data about supply routes and uses that data combined with a set of algorithms to model the most efficient path for a goods assembly, from raw material to packaged item. So in this scenario, which I should say is still mostly hypothetical, it's kind of the dream of SEM, no one holds all the information. Rather, the supply path is created through machine learning protocols, about which no individual person can really claim full insight. I think these distributed information networks are important, and I'll explain why in a minute. So capital, as we know from David Harvey and others, has a particular relationship to space and time. For capitalism to function properly on a global scale, capital has to keep moving. For capitalism, it can't ever stop, and an economy must always grow. But even as capital increases, it must also be reabsorbed somehow. If it can't be reabsorbed and recirculated, it accumulates, and this causes a crisis. And so if, for example, goods pile up in a warehouse, they're not circulating, and they lose their value. Because capital needs to find more and more places to go, global capital has a tendency, as we've learned, to expand outward, looking for ever more ways to keep capital moving. And the supply chain cockpit is startling here, for the way that capital's need to circulate unceasingly has been translated directly into a software suite that addresses potential crises with marvelous speed and sophistication. No potential accumulation can take place without triggering a solution, and models borrowed from the dendritic structures of our brains chart paths designed to eliminate even the slightest latency. And yet, even as this space-time compression seems to reach its apogee, it's pushed toward ever greater heights of information speed and efficiency. And here I think of the fear of Ingrid's middle managers. The supply chain expert craves transparency and perfect knowledge. Blockchain, RFID tags, and the Internet of Things are all part of this quest toward perfect omniscience of the location of objects at all points in time and space. The NetWeaver gateway that sort of takes all this kind of heterogeneous data and then kind of makes it all homogeneous so that it can be read within the SAP business suite. It's kind of emblematic of this move to take all the kind of, illegible data from the world and turn it into knowable categories. Now, the literature on machine learning in supply chains is consistent on this point. Vast quantities of data and sophisticated self-healing algorithms are necessary because this way the machine can decide where goods should travel and how they should be assembled. Machine learning in supply chains is about eliminating latency and promoting efficiency, and that's definitely true. But it's also about displacing decision-making power, at least rhetorically, from individual actors to this algorithmic no man's land, where no one has to take responsibility for what happens next. Lessons from the past, this is a quote, about SCM can be incorporated into, quote, decisions about the future, one machine learning article claims, but without any moment of decision-making ever perceptibly taking place. And so if you'll permit me, I want to linger a little longer in this algorithmic no man's land of both knowing and not knowing to talk about the prehistory not only of the contemporary supply chain, but of the epistemological regime in which it is possible to think about capital, movement, and human life in these terms. I trace it here to a historical episode that I think both authorized and prefigured some of the contemporary supply chain's most outrageous abuses. So I'm going to move away from SAP briefly, but I promise I'll come back to it. The slave ship Zong set out in September 1781 from West Africa, carrying 440 enslaved African people. 3 months later, neared to port but faced with illness and a shortage of water, the Zong's crew made a calculation. If the slaves were to die on shore, the ship's owners would not recover their cost. If they were to die on board of natural causes, their value would likewise be lost. The ship's insurance, however, did cover the jettisoning of cargo. So over a period of 3 days, in September 1781, the crew of the Zong threw 133 men, women, and children into the sea, where they perished. The Zong became a flashpoint for the abolitionist movement because it so baldly exposed slavery's unthinkable inhumanity. Ian Bauckham, in his book Spectres of the Atlantic, writes that the Zong also has a different significance. It's not only a moment that exposes the cruelty of slavery, it's an episode in which the mechanisms of what Bauckham calls speculative reason are laid bare with unusual clarity. Part of what Bauckham perceives in the Zong is a kind of apotheosis of global finance capital. The value of the slaves has taken wing, evacuated their bodies. Why else could the crew throw the slaves into the sea and still receive payment for them? The enslaved body is understood as one manifestation of a circulating system of credit, but not, in this case, the most important one. So in finance capital, value can reside in different places at different times without any handover actually taking place. Thus, value in finance capital is divorced from its commodity or material form and replaced by much more mobile, more easily transmissible forms, namely credit. These movements, of course, anticipate SAP's supply chain cockpit. Capitalism could not move at the speed of neural networks unless it existed in a supremely mobile form, similar to the way it did on the Zong. But I bring the Zong up here not only because it demonstrates how value works in finance capital, but also because of what Bauckham says about the kind of knowledge on which the Zong and its creditors depended in order to make the specific calculation that they made, that of what he calls the typical. The embrace of the notion of the typical, that is, the qualities one can expect from the kind of thing one is dealing with, is a hallmark of finance capital. An insurer must cast the particular into types in order to sort them into categories on an actuarial table, which he then uses to make a calculation about risk. The translation of a human being into a predictable value, and thus a unit that can be circulated and traded, depends on the classification of that human being into a particular category. And here I should cite Christina Sharp and Norbese Phillip, who both informed my thinking on this. Without categories, there is no insurance, and without insurance, there is no Zong. So this is the metamorphosis that took place even before the slaves were forced onto the Zong, that of the particular body into one of a range of computable values on the actuarial spreadsheet. And in my analysis, this too is the specter that haunts the contemporary supply chain. What might seem to be just a peculiar form of bookkeeping in which an imaginary free-floating value can actually divest itself from a material body is a fundamental protocol of finance capitalism. Echoes of the Zong reverberated in 2014 when The Guardian broke the news that Burmese migrants are being forced into slavery to work aboard shrimp boats off the coast of Thailand. Logan Koch, the company's vice president for responsible sourcing, had the following to say. The supply chain is quite cloudy, especially when it comes from offshore. Is it possible that a little of this stuff is leaking through? Yeah, it is possible. We are all aware of it. For the shrimp executive, the problem in the supply chain is climatological, not systemic. Supply chains are cloudy, they leak, things happen. Again, we find ourselves in this no man's land where events unfold and all responsibility can be disavowed. We know when our shrimp will arrive, but their route to us is saturated in a dense fog. The supply chain depends on this balance between the information it can assimilate into itself and that it cannot, information that is accepted and information that is refused or disavowed. Data in SAP's model is supremely interchangeable. And here I would sort of remind you of the NetWeaver gateway. In practice, in structure, and I would argue by design, SAP has taken great pains to assimilate the heterogeneous data that passes through its system. But even as the supply chain cannot abide heterogeneity in its data, it depends ultimately on other kinds of difference for its very existence. Difference in standards of living so that Chinese workers can be paid so little, racial and gender difference so that it seems natural that Bangladeshi women, for example, should work for a pittance in a dangerous apparel sweatshop, or that Burmese men would find themselves enslaved on shrimping boats far from home. To accommodate these competing demands, the company in supply chain capitalism must operate in a peculiar epistemological zone, one in which it ravenously consumes some data, such as that about price and location, even as it cannot absorb other data, such as that about labor practices. In other words, it wants perfect access to information, but only some information. I suggest we can see this ambivalent relationship to information in the SCM data model and system architecture itself. Information adheres always and only to the object itself. The surrounding data is sloughed away, and we're left with information about the product, where it goes, where its progress is arrested, and where it moves forward. The SCM data model and machine learning protocols, combined with cross-cutting systems integration, accomplishes this balancing act of perfect knowledge and perfect ignorance. It allows corporations to refuse any knowledge about some aspects of their business, while embracing near-perfect information from other parts. And the result of all this is goods whose arrival we can predict to the hour, but whose conditions of assembly remain mysterious by design. Thank you.